My name is Zainab. I work in the University of Leicester. So a little background to this conference. First, I'll start by welcoming you to our conference, and we hope that it will be a very engaging and interesting experience for you and an opportunity to share experiences and knowledge regarding decolonizing knowledge and participatory methodologies. So last year in 2021, we submitted an application to the British Academy to hold this conference to be hosted by the British Academy, but unfortunately it wasn't successful. So we decided to continue, along with all the presenters, to see that we had an opportunity, because we believe this is a very important topic, and I think our voices need to be heard, just so that everyone is aware of some of the work that we're doing regarding decolonizing knowledge production and participatory methodologies. So at that time, we wanted to be an opportunity for both, established academics, mid-career, and new, the younger ones coming up. But unfortunately, it wasn't possible to do it in person. But now we have the opportunity, and I'm happy to say that Professor De Souza Santos will be joining us tomorrow for the keynote address. So please try and be there, just so that you also benefit from his knowledge. Also, why this is being hosted by the Center for Trust, Peace, and Social Relations. Last year, both myself, and up to this year, I think early this year, both myself and Joanna were working at CTPSR with Gordon, who is the head of the research group of global inequalities and development. So we work together, which is why it is still being hosted by CTPSR, but Joanna is now on her own, and I'm also working in another place. But I am happy to say I'm still a visiting research fellow at CTPSR. So together with Joanna, Gordon, and participants, we hope to take this body of knowledge forward. I'll now hand over to Joanna for some brief remarks. Thank you.
Thanks, Zainab, and welcome to everyone on Zoom and on Facebook Live. It's great that there's so much interest in this topic, and really hope that you will find this a very interesting discussion. We've tried to think about how we can make the format of the conference as engaging and decolonial as possible in terms of the kind of conversations we can have, which is why we've got a structure that is going to be in roundtables rather than presentations. So we're going to try to make it as inclusive as possible within the limits of the format. And I'm sorry that we're not all together in person, but it is a great opportunity for so many people to be able to join. And thank you very much to those of you who've gotten up early, because the timing is obviously the morning in the UK. So I know some people have gotten up early. So thank you very much, or stayed up late. Thank you for joining us. I just wanted to say, well, maybe just quickly. So I'm Joanna Wheeler, and I'm a research fellow at the University of Western Cape in South Africa. And I'm running my own organization on transformative storytelling. And I was at CTPSR last year with Gordon and Zainab when Zainab really initiated the idea for this conference. So it's been great to work with both of them on organizing it, and I'm really looking forward to all the roundtables. Just really quickly on sort of the academic motivation for doing this conference. When we were together at CTPSR, we were discussing, a lot of the issues of decolonization that I think have come more to the fore recently in academia, particularly in the UK, but in other parts of the world before that, I would say. And there has been a lot of debate and a lot of things that have been written and published about decolonizing. It's not a new issue or question, but it's maybe more urgent at the moment. And a lot of times I think that literature can be very abstract and theoretical, which is important. We do need to have that. But on the other hand, a lot of the literature around participatory methodologies tends towards the more practical and applied, and doesn't always have that more critical theoretical lens to it. That's obviously not all of it. There's exceptions in both cases, but just to sort of generalize. And So I think one of the main motivations for this conference was to try and connect those two things to each other, because I think that a lot of people who work with participatory methods are very familiar with the challenges in practice of decolonizing knowledge, but they might not use that language to talk about it. And similarly, people who are interested in decolonizing knowledge are looking for ways that that can be done in practice. And so that's really what we're hoping to do in these 2 days, is really think about those connections and take them further. And we hope that this will be useful for everyone, that it will give us all things to think about in our work going forward. So with that said, I'm going to hand over to Gordon.
Thank you very much, and good day to all. Let me add my welcome to that of Zainab and Joanna. My name is Gordon Crawford, and I work at the Centre for Trust, Peace and Social Relations at Coventry University. As was mentioned, this conference was originally conceived when the three of us were all together at CTPSR. Sadly for me, I'm now the only surviving member of that group left, Zainab and Joanna having moved on. But I think the conference is very relevant to the general work of the centre. In particularly, we focus on participatory methodologies to produce knowledge that reflects the perspectives of those marginalised people whose voices are less regularly and less routinely heard, be it in Coventry, in the West Midlands, or in countries of the Global South. The centre also has the aspiration, like many other places, to be involved in practices of decolonising knowledge. Personally, my background is that I've worked for many years in the area of what was called development studies, now frequently referred to as international development or global development. And I think that the focus of the conference is also very relevant for that sector. Development studies has been attempting for some time now to distance itself from some of its more colonial aspects. For example, the focus on alternative and radical conceptions of development has tried to do this. A specific decolonial intent has been emphasized more so in recent times, and we've seen study groups reflecting this emerge within both the Development Studies Association and EADI, the European Association of Development Research Institutes. So there is a relatively new decolonizing development study group in the DSA, and a longer established EADI working group on post and decolonial perspectives on development. And of course, when it comes to participatory methodologies, these have been both much practiced and much debated within the sphere of development studies for some decades now, especially with the participation as tyranny or as transformation debates of the early noughties. So I hope that this conference will bring together what have often been more disparate debates and explore what synergies there are between attempts at decolonizing knowledge and participatory approaches. So welcome once again to all. Let's proceed with the first roundtable.
Thanks, Gordon. Okay, so welcome to anyone who's just joining us on Zoom or on live stream. Great to have you with us. The first question we're talking about is from your experience with participatory methodologies, what does it mean to decolonize knowledge? Just a small question to kick us off. And can you give us any examples of what you think that looks like in practice?
Hi, everybody. So I'm S.J. Kupanok, and I'm based at Centre for African Studies and Social Anthropology. And
good morning, everyone. I am Dudu Ndlovu, and I'm based at the African Centre for Migration and Society at WITS in Johannesburg. Thank you for the questions and for inviting us to be part of this conference. So for me, I come into this conference not as someone who says, like, I don't carry the tag that I use participatory methods, because I think methods have to be chosen because they are appropriate for whatever context, which is also the way in which I would also engage with how do we decolonize knowledge, because I don't know if there's anything inherent in the methods that we choose that would make a method a decolonizing method, but it's about how we apply it in the particular context that we find ourselves in the particular work that we want to do. So I think participatory methodologies have a potential to be decolonial, but it's also possible that they can be applied in a way that does not necessarily disrupt any of the work, any of the power dynamics that we find in the different contexts that we work in.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, when Dudu and I were thinking through this, we were just thinking about the fact that we really need to carefully reflect on how we frame particular conversations and practices and how we understand particular terms. And like Dudu was saying, don't necessarily think that there's a particular methodology is inherently decolonizing, nor necessarily that we can decolonize knowledge through a methodology. Instead, we can maybe think about a methodology as a space like any other where we can reflect on coloniality and decoloniality and try and resist the former and create space for the latter. Because, you know, as we were reflecting on this, we were thinking about decolonizing as an expansive project. It's economic, it speaks to the material, the psychological, the social, cultural. And that means there's both a utility and a danger of focusing on methodology. The utility comes, we were thinking, from the need to focus on all elements of our research practice. And so it's useful to focus on methodologies as part of that. But the danger comes from starting to potentially to compartmentalize a struggle. And that danger, we were thinking, was just so crucial at a time when decolonizing has become kitsch, when it's become a brand, it's become a keyword, it's become something that would make us more likely to be hired by an academic establishment. So we need to think about the grammar of our conversations around decolonizing knowledge. You know, where does it become acceptable to pause? And if we think about a methodology as decolonizing, does it then become acceptable to rest there? So we were thinking largely about kind of participatory methodologies as one locus where that struggle continues.
With your last minute, can you give us an example of what decolonizing looks like in practice?
So it's expansive, right? So in some senses, it's about troubling that idea of giving us that kind of neat example. But maybe we could talk about some of the examples we were thinking through, Dudu.
Yeah, I think for me, decolonizing is quite contextual. And it comes about out of really reflecting on, so for example, for me as a researcher, I am already in a context, I come into a context imbued with certain privileges and power. For example, the fact that I'm aligned to a university or a recognized member of an institution like that. And so, as an example, for example, in a space where I'm wanting to do research, it would be about reflecting on what my positionality brings into that context and what it means. And maybe if we're thinking about participatory methodologies, where I am inviting people into a space to kind of direct the research engagement, what does it still mean for me as a researcher getting into a community and inviting people? Does that necessarily destabilize the power dynamics? Does that necessarily do anything different? And as well, I think thinking about what is it that we would say is decolonial knowledge? And is it something that we find out there, or is it something that we are constructing with our work?
Excellent question. Thank you very much for keeping to time as well. Lots to think about there. So I'm gonna, Lata, are you ready?
Yes, thank you. Right, so firstly, thank you so much for the invitation to participate. It's just a real thrill to be here, to be included, and to have the opportunity to share in the space that you've created. So my name is Lata Narayanaswamy. I'm an associate professor in the politics of global development in the School of Politics and International Studies at the University of Leeds. And so I think, so in terms of answering the questions, I mean, I would start by saying that I agree absolutely with what's been said so far, in the sense that I appreciate the way in which the terms of the debate have been widened. S.J. Cooper and Dudu, I think that's really helpful. And I think for me, I would want to reiterate that by saying that I think part of our challenge here, and it'd be useful to think through even with people who have logged in today, because I recognize many of the people who have lots of really interesting and important things to say about these issues, is that as Linda Tuhiwai-Smith has kind of reminded us, the research process is inherently problematic. The whole notion of research is problematic. And I think widening that lens allows us then to really reflect on what would bring us to ask this question, and then to be honest about the limits of what participation allows us to do. So what it could do is to say, okay, if I am engaging in a research process in whatever way that's been deemed meaningful, then the actual way in which I go about collecting information to answer whatever question I've set out should be including a range of voices. As a matter of principle and increasingly good practice, that's sort of become a norm. I'm not sure what's decolonial about that. So I'm not sure I would be comfortable in sort of saying that there was some way to be participatory that was very explicitly decolonial, because it kind of reflects exactly what both S.J. Cooper and Dudu have said, which I agree with, which is that really the limit of our ambition in a way? So for me, and the sort of the advanced contribution I made was trying to draw some of this out, really, which is to say, I think actually we've kind of lost the decolonial battle almost on principle before we even enter into this space, right? So higher education is absolutely, and has historically been, the center of the ways in which knowledge was and continues to be colonized. So we've already lost that battle, because we already enter these spaces having set out what we're going to research. And I don't say that as somebody that is above it. I'm very much implicated in that system, and I am incentivized to behave that way. So the challenge then for me, I would rather think about kind of winning the battles I can win, if you like. So how can I use the resources that are available to me, which invariably uses more time and more energy than I'm typically given in those very narrow windows you have to apply for money, to try to work out, well, who can I talk to so that it isn't just me making sense of something in my head. Invariably then, the whole decolonial kind of approach requires lots of extra work and time and energy and input. I'm perfectly happy to do. But in the way that we work and operate in higher education globally, because the way that higher education even works is in itself colonial in nature, and the way higher education looks in large parts of the world is in itself a colonial legacy. So we are all part of that system, working to this very similar sorts of incentives. And some of these ideas I've sort of worked with colleagues who are in the room today, and, you know, thinking about, okay, so that takes more work, but it's worth doing, because for me the outcome is better. I wanted to just pick up the grammar of our conversations. That's a lovely phrase, and I'm afraid I might have to steal it, because it's very, very nice, and it really captures just the challenge, which is we have to be thinking carefully about how we talk. I would also argue that we need to extend where we think about who is participating. So in other words, I would also again sort of say that we need to be thinking about participation in a research process more broadly, and widen away from that focus on methodology. There are things to say about Indigenous knowledge as well, but I will leave it there, and I think there's lots of scope to talk about lots of things. Thanks.
Thanks, Lata. Sorry to rush you on that last point that you were getting into, but hopefully as we go through the questions, we'll be able to come back to some of these things, because I think that what you've all three done so far really, really well is set out the debate that we're trying to have. You know, what is the shape of it? What is it that we're actually talking about here? So it's really interesting to hear from you. Are you ready, Zainab?
Yes.
Okay, great.
So building on what Dudu, SJ, and Lata said, to me, borrowing Linda Smith's voice, it is more, I look at this as more of as a goal of social justice, where power is passed to my participants, for example. So using participatory methodologies, to me, as a means of decolonizing knowledge production, is that some of these advantages are related with the process of collectively undertaking and generating research findings. So for example, I use participatory video in my work. And during this process, you know, it is a collective discussion and decision whereby my participants have the power, you know, to determine what they want to say and how they want their voices to be heard. I look at it as an opportunity to lead to qualitative changes in power relations, like I said, and also the way that knowledge will highlight marginalized perspectives and challenges to structures of injustice. So thinking about, you know, knowledge production, decolonizing knowledge production, a lot has been said, you know, by Francis Yamjo, De Souza Santos, Ndlovu Gasheni, and so many others. So for us, it is for us to, I think, keep questioning ourselves, you know, over and over again in terms of the way we do our work, for those of us that are researchers, and how to break down some of these, you know, hierarchies and bring it down to the level of those that we work with, so that they have a power, they have a right and power to determine what is being, you know, constituted as knowledge, rather than just coming from the top, you know, and insisting on, okay, this is what I want to be heard. So for me, I use participatory videos, like I said, as an empowerment tool, you know, and it is also used as a medium to facilitate dialogue within the communities that I work with. And most importantly, it is being a source of dialogue between the researcher and participant. It is the way in which, you know, this knowledge is acquired or discovered, that we get to know what is real, you know, rather than just being forming knowledge based on what other peoples have said.
Okay, thank you, Zainab. Some interesting thoughts there. So the last speaker we're going to hear from is Anna.
Okay, so I introduce myself very, very briefly. So I work at the University of Bath. I'm a reader in the Department of Social and Policy Sciences, and my research is on social movements, critical sociology, and mainly the principle of hope and Bloch's contemporary uses of hope, open Marxism, humanist Marxism, feminism, and it's within this framework that I discussed coloniality or decoloniality. And that's why my participation is titled How to Understand this Decolonization within the Global Politics of Hope. That is a kind of research field that I've been trying to create. So to answer the question, just briefly, I think the epistemology of the South is very important for our research. And for me, the connection with hope is that there is no hope without decolonizing, whatever it means. So I don't think perhaps that decolonizing methodologies or decolonizing knowledge is the right expression, despite the fact that we all use it, because what we want is, as Boaventura says, an ecology of knowledges. So this is what is decolonizing. So in the process, we perhaps get there. So for me, I think we shouldn't, in practice, we shouldn't forget, we shouldn't depoliticize the process. So for me, in practice, I do take seriously the fact that the struggles or the movements I work with are epistemic struggles as well, like Icasa and Vasquez argues. So they are not only, you know, struggling for food or shelter, but also for the meaning they give to this and how they want to do it. And so In practice, I think that from my experience, not all, as it was said, not all participatory action research methods are decolonizing, and we still need to do more. And perhaps with the other question of challenges, we can discuss what are the problems. But a space of knowledge is a space of struggle. So I think it's very important where to position ourselves. That's why I think that there is no way for me to implement any methodology, participatory and decolonial, if I don't believe that I am for anti-oppressive and a cognitive justice. And it's true that we live in this, as Boaventura says, a cognitive empire, but empire is not completely homogeneous at all. I don't think, Lata, that we have lost the battle. We had to expose all these problems right there. And so we have created this DECNO, decolonizing knowledge in research and teaching and practice at Bath is the worst place to create this kind of decolonizing center, but we did. So I think in practice, the way I see the application of decolonizing methodologies, the PAR methodology is taking for Fals Borda. He kind of created the participatory action methods, but he was talking about a methodology that is senti pensante, which means thinking, feeling together. And so you can establish a conversation. And again, a bit of disagreement that the conversation is not as we talk about a conversation. A conversation is not a technique to achieve something or to gather information. The conversation is a genuine dialogue between equals, and it is in itself, not a tool, but in itself is a process of decolonizing. And so this conversation, there are some authors, Ortiz Ocaña, I have written here, and Arias Lopez, they talk about that, breaking of course, the barriers between researcher and the participant, but also genuinely thinking that we have something to learn. I know it rings a bell and we all try to do that, but the problem we have that we will discuss in the question 3 is that we really need to unlearn and really be positioned in a different place and unlearn Western academia and position in a different place. So in these conversations, definitely there has to be some self-reflection. And as we go and talk to people and try to learn, we also had to expose ourselves. So it's a genuine conversation. So of course, it's not only a participatory methodology where we propose, come and participate with me. I don't know why we call it like that, but when it's senti pensante and we think with the heart, really, we also need to give. And I think in that moment, we are decolonizing and becoming political. We are talking about emancipation here. We're talking about oppression. And of course, as I can only see SJ said, is big. Is a big thing, but we're not going to do it during the dialogue. But the dialogue will not, at least, this conversation will not contribute to oppression, which is a lot already, because we're constantly contributing to reproducing a system of oppression. So at least if we can establish that conversation, we are liberating that space, even if it's for a brief period of time. So this is, in my experience, it's more like a holistic, complex dialogue that we need to train ourselves, because it is difficult to implement. And one example could be that we have at Bath a project, Indigeneity and Higher Education, and to see the trajectories of indigenous people in higher education in Mexico. And I experienced with many of the researchers that they are also indigenous. And of course, indigeneity is something that people define themselves, and they might not live in a community, but there was a problem in the sense that not having this conversation in the pilot, we'll fix it, not having this kind of conversation, the indigenous person who is doing the interview is producing a situation, make the other person, put the other person who's also indigenous studying at university in a very difficult situation. If they would have opened up and create this dialogue, the interview would have developed in a different way. So we're training in this respect. So that's an example of what I'm saying, that when we talk about the epistemologies of the South, is not theory, is practice. It's just to position ourselves from the margins, from the epistemological point of the South.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you. I'm really sorry that we don't have more time. Thank you. You each have such really interesting and slightly different points of view. And I think it would be great if we had a lot more time than we do, but sadly we have to finish within the hour. So I'm going to move us on. So the next two questions are, what do you think are the main challenges for connecting participatory methodologies to decolonizing knowledge? Maybe you don't even think that should be done. So if so, then you can say that. And where do you see the potential ways forward to push the boundaries for decolonizing knowledge? And you've already, some of you have already spoken to that, but can you say a little bit more about where are you taking this in your own work, or where do you think the possibilities are? We'll just do the same order again. So can we go back to Dudu and SJ?
So yeah, I guess when we're thinking about different challenges about those connections, so in part that's for us when we were discussing this about returning to some of those core questions. What do we think the relationship is, for example, between decoloniality and participatory methods? Are we thinking about democracy, inclusion and decolonizing as part of the same project, or are we thinking about them as different? And I think that becomes particularly important when we're thinking about participatory methods, because they have been justified in terms of democracy and inclusion in much of the literature in the past. And I think kind of relating participatory methods to decoloniality specifically is part of a very related but distinct kind of and also long-running trajectory in the literature, but one that does need to be held in its own space. And then, you know, as Dudu mentioned before, and this for us was a big one, do we think about decolonial knowledge as something that is found, discovered, revalued, amplified? Or are we thinking about it as something that is kind of necessarily created and co-created? And so those have been kind of one set of challenges for us. And a second set has been the relationship between participatory methods and methodologies. So if we think about methods as specific tools, and we think about methodologies as overall kind of strategies and approaches, and maybe to concretize this, I just mentioned briefly some of the work I did way back in 2008 with Abahlali Basamjondolo, so with as a master's project. Now, part of that research was researching their approach to housing, land and dignity, the struggles that they're involved in South Africa. Part of that was me proposing a research proposal to them that was taken to a community meeting, was debated to see if it had value, and then I was given permission or not to kind of do the work. And then part of that research was also me asking Abahlali what would be useful in return, because I had kind of opened that discussion on a particular topic, what would it be useful for me, if anything, to research within some of the areas that I was researching, defined by residents. And one of the things that came up as particularly useful for them at that moment in those political struggles was a quantitative survey that was done with residents that was seen as kind of representative and that they could use in their bargaining with the government, and protest and struggle with the government. And rendering the settlement legible in a very particular way was politically useful for them at a particular moment. So that meant that in some ways a quantitative study became a kind of the form of research method that the movement had selected. How do we position that within our discussions of what participation is, where it enters into the research process and what it means? And I think those kind of conversations become equally an important part of that broader kind of conversation, holding that space. Dudu.
And so I think building on that, I will move on to the third question, which is about the potential ways that we can push the boundaries to decolonize knowledge. And from our discussions, I suppose we had more of pushing ourselves to critique what we are doing. So instead of the kind of excitement that we have found the answer, I think we need more and more to be reflecting on what we are doing and what it means in the different contexts. So thinking about, in the first place, what is it that we are looking for when we are decolonizing knowledge? Are we, do we have this romantic idea, which is very nice to have, that there are certain people, there are certain, for example, Lata talked about indigenous knowledges. Sometimes we are thinking of decolonizing and we are thinking indigenous knowledges are what holds this decolonial knowledge that we're looking for. And yet sometimes we are again falling back into the ways in which the colonial project has framed and given positions for everyone. So I think for us going forward, just one of the things that we are thinking about is really reflecting on what it means to decolonize and what is it we are looking for in decolonizing. And is it something that we are going to find somewhere, or perhaps we are constantly having to be asking ourselves questions and really being ruthless with critiquing our work and what our work means?
I sort of enjoyed listening to your contributions, both of you, Dudu and S.J. Cooper. I suppose in answer to question 2, I think the main challenge is I'm not entirely sure it's really possible. I actually just don't think it's the right question. I think I think that question has a set of presumptions that underpin a set of activities that we undertake in higher education that actually values research in and of itself as an inherently good thing. And I'm just not sure I'm convinced about that. I feel like very often research is a kind of displacement activity to find out stuff that we kind of already know. And it can act as a self-justification. I quite like the sort of reflecting on ourselves critically, duty that you mentioned, sort of, and that for me has to be the heart. So for me, pushing the boundaries of decolonizing has to start with why we want to decolonize. So then the language of participation for me is asking, who gets to participate? What are they participating in? What is it about their participation that we value? And that allows us to start actually challenging the categories that we use to delineate that participation. So categories of indigenous, for instance, are deeply problematic, right? That is a deeply politicized term that has built into it the language of othering, because what we then say is, here's this indigenous set against a mainstream. I find that really problematic. I think, Anna, your point about pluriversality is well taken. I think part of what is a concern for me in that is simply to suggest that the danger of thinking that there are knowledges out there that we can tap into that sit separate from the things that I may or may not know is also challenging, because we don't live in a world where people's knowledges don't interact. And actually the language of development itself is so deeply embedded in our shared consciousness. That's always been at the core of a lot of the work that I've done, which is to say, is there anybody that isn't implicated in the language of development? And actually, even anecdotally, we live in a world where people are sort of really working quite hard to show that they are developed. The civilizational project was absolutely about showing that you were developed enough to govern yourself. So it's deeply raced, it's deeply gendered, and it's highly unequal. And research has a tendency to reinscribe those hierarchies. So where then do we start in thinking about the value of participation? What are people even participating in? I don't know. So for me, what is it decolonizing about? For me, I would want to start with thinking about research that isn't just about the value of that research accruing to myself. That's the starting point. So already participatory methodologies for me are problematic because ultimately we seem to be taking ourselves out of the picture. But the fact is, even with a participatory methodology, I'm the one that, gets the academic job, gets the promotion, gets to write stuff, gets to show up in a space like this. I mean, the irony is not lost on me. I'm saying that here in this exclusive password protected space. But I think we need to problematize that. So it can also be in those everyday actions. I've been in those meetings where certain people aren't allowed to speak. And I feel an obligation as somebody who is a global North researcher to try to create space to ensure that everybody's had a turn to voice their views. We also then need to think about how we work with others. And the ways in which we bring people into those spaces that in order to explore the issues that we want to explore. But I think for me, the main thing about decolonizing, so I'm just again looking at the question, we have to be so for me, there's two things. There's the what we know and how we know it. So the language of our expression. So this is what I've said in my little contribution. So, the English language, but then also how we know. So the peer-reviewed papers, the ways in which we seek out collaboration. We have to be questioning all of those things. And that has to then also be about that level of introspection as well. So when the benefits stop accruing just to ourselves, I think we'll be on a much better path. There's so many other things we could say about that, but I think we have to sort of think about decolonizing higher education in a very broad sense, and then use the language of participation to maybe reimagine what it is that higher education research actually allows us to do. In order to sort of build that pluriverse, if you like. But I'll leave it there. Thanks.
So for me, building on what Dudu, SJ, and Lata said, and going back also to what Anna said earlier, for me, in terms of the challenges and how to, move this forward, there's this issue of, reflexivity. The issue of continuously questioning myself in the way I do research. I always ask myself, am I getting it right? Is it Zainab's voice that is being heard, or the women that I am working with? For example, my work, for those of you that have watched the film, I worked with the women in the Niger Delta. And the important thing for me was for their voices to be heard. And in thinking about, decolonizing, and getting their voices heard, it has to do, more about impact, something that will call attention to their plight and bring about change. So continuously, questioning myself and also determining who gets to participate and how. And most importantly, like Lata mentioned, when it comes to, the academic publications, for me, I decided it's not about the journal article that very few will read and even understand, or the book. It is something more, it is something to do with a document or a material that is legible and accessible to a wide variety of audiences. For example, thinking about impact. So for me, I'm thinking maybe Nigerian government. I'm thinking about Shell, for example, which is the major player in Nigeria in the oil dynamics, So something that will be accessible. They don't have to take time to watch, maybe just 20, 30 minutes. They hear the voices of the women, this is really important. So in taking this forward, going back to us as researchers, we have to continuously think about how to empower, how to pass the power to the people that we're working with, just so that we could push the boundaries of decolonizing knowledge production a lot more. Because you have your set of questions, you discuss with them. I like what SJ said about the project that she worked on. For me, going to the Delta, I went not as, the UK-based researcher. I went to them as a woman, as a mother, and as a Nigerian, I went and in fact, I even took off my hijab and I sat with them, we discussed, we engaged. And that enabled, an opportunity to build trust in the work that I am doing, and also it opened up that opportunity to get that, insider view, that is not always, possible sometimes when you just post the normal academic questions. So I think in terms of, taking this forward, a lot has to do with us as researchers, continuously thinking about who gets to participate, how, and why, rather than relying on certain people maybe to give us access. In the course of your dialogue, you'll be able to get, opportunities to open up more and also get them to understand, for example, the participants, that in terms of building knowledge, your voices are really important. It's not only about, like the epistemologies of the South that Anna mentioned. So a lot more needs to be done. And I think we really have to push ourselves as researchers to see how we could break some of these hierarchies and go down to the level of the people that we work with. For me, women. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, no, thinking about the main challenges, I think, Sarah Mota once highlighted that, as we said before, participatory action research methods are not necessarily anti-oppressive. So I think the key issue, the main challenge is really to unlearn, as Zainab was telling, unlearn what we are and what we do. And everybody has personal experiences with academia. I personally, I'm from Argentina with a European background. I feel really oppressed, and I have been the subject of the coloniality of power at the university. So Lata, obviously, or Lasha has different experience. I don't feel like a researcher in the North giving people a voice. I feel myself like going to a trajectory where I kind of overcame some of the problems and others are there. White doesn't mean not being, from the South. So I will tell you more about this. The second challenge for me is to clarify the concept. We talk about inclusion here, and I put in the chat, inclusion is not a decolonial concept because someone has to include. And that's why I mentioned pluriversality. So I think we need to discuss more about this concept, the concepts that we use, because pluriversality means that we accept that there are knowledges that we don't know. They are because they have been sent to oblivion. They have been marginalized. Ages ago, during the process of colonization that started in 1492, as Ventura says, the line was crossed. This is knowledge, this is culture, this is something else. So that is important as well, that we're not talking about the same. And the final thing, I think, in terms of the how to push, I think with the senti pensante feeling thinking approach, we are challenging objectivity and scientificity. And so we have to push it to propose that, the students, for example, they always struggle a lot with what is objective and what is not objective. And I have a lot of experience in academia, and it's difficult for them. They want to put both sides to evaluate. Well, I mean, we had to politicize decolonization. We had to be on one side, which is the side of empowering people and emancipation. If you're on another side, then don't use decolonizing, just be with empire. But I think we need to really reflect on this. This is politics, and people are struggling, and some of them are dying. So it's not simply a discussion between us about what methodology. I think it's really, we could really make a difference. So this type of objectivity that False Border presents is deeply decolonizing, in the sense that entails also feelings, perceptions, the body, and different ways of approaching things. And I think this is a good way to spend public money on. No one will oppose that we are helping communities to live well. Only that when it gets too political, no one wants to give us the money, but that's another, we learn how to.
Thanks, Anna. Right, so lots to think about in what has been said so far, and thank you very much to all of you for your thoughtful comments. There's quite a few comments and questions in the chat. The first question that we have in the chat is, what role does empathy and love play in decolonizing knowledge, and particularly epistemologies of the South? Has the role of empathy and love changed in academia? Are we more inclined towards incorporating it now in 2021 than before? Okay, go ahead, SJ.
So I think we could maybe think about, I think it's really important to think about love as political, And I think if we think about love as sentimental, that is problematic. Love as political is really crucial. But I think maybe an important entry point into this is solidarity, through like love through kind of solidarity, because then we get to tap into very rich and important conversations around, for example, the role of difference in solidarity, what transnational solidarities might look like, what national solidarities might look like, and therefore we don't risk, for example, kind of collapsing the important political conversations and space we need to hold open and the critical interrogation we need to have into something that becomes love as sentiment rather than love as politics.
Thanks, SJ. Okay, next question. If we have or are planning to spend our lives and careers in academia, how do we establish relationship, ways of relating and ways of being that are profoundly disruptive to colonial intent of higher education? So this isn't about a specific research project, but how we live as academics and what kinds of long-term relationships we seek out through our research and teaching encounters to decolonize the institution over the course of our careers and bring about longer-term change. Okay, Lata.
Yes, thanks. So I'm assuming you've looked at, that's Peter's question. And I think it's an important one, because I think what I think I always feel a little bit like the harbinger of doom. I showed up in spaces like this and I'm just going wah, wah, wah about HE, and that feels profoundly unhelpful. And I don't mean to sound that way. But it's a good point, because I think in a way, part of what might make this more manageable is if we see decolonizing as a process rather than an outcome. Because I think if we can sort of think, actually, that continuous reflection, which honestly is like my day-to-day reality, and it's tiring, but I don't think we should be putting the kind of pressure on ourselves to always have the answers. And I think it's about, again, going back to the very fantastic point that SJ Dudu, you made right at the beginning, which is that widening. You started off our conversation, which allowed us to widen the lens. So how do we constantly think about our own practices? Who gets to participate in the spaces that we're in? And does that mean we're going to get it right all the time? Not at all. But when there are opportunities to push back, we should be. And I would also, again, pick up on this point. The business of love as political is really good. And I like the language of solidarity. The thing that I'm finding really important is that we can't afford to also see ourselves on our own. And again, it's really funny because in HE, we are incentivized to behave that way. We're incentivized to single author publish and, elevate our own profiles. But actually, the richest kind of engagements are about how many people can you bring into a space? And so we are very often working against the incentives that are built into the system. I'm not suggesting I have all the answers. That would be deeply arrogant. I would never do that. But certainly in my own sort of way of approaching this, it isn't about me. It's trying to work out in whatever space I'm in, who is the us? And then whether that's about students and pedagogy, whether that's about research, whether that's research planning, who is in that space? And that constant kind of reflection that asks those core questions on, who gets to participate, who is in this space, who is being excluded, who has the power to make those decisions, where is the money being controlled? And I think particularly for us as global North actors, I think we have to work a little bit harder. And I'll just make this point, Joanna, very quickly, because I know we're trying to wrap up, but I do think we have to be aware of those dynamics, because we have to be careful that participation of so-called global South actors is enough. My experience of that is that you can bring people into a space. Again, we internalize those global North-South dynamics. So you know what? When we control the money, lots of other people are quiet. So we've got to work extra hard to tell people, we really do want to know what you think, just because we're controlling the purse strings, because that's a bit of the sort of the jigsaw that I'm not able to control. What we can control is then how we work out collectively what we do with that money. I have found those dynamics really, really hard. But it's just an ongoing process. I wish I had a better answer, but I don't.
Thanks, Lata. Okay, so there's a question here for you, Zainab. Zainab, who decided on the video methodology in your project? I'm asking this question because many academics will motivate for certain participatory methods as valuable when they've actually imposed these methods on participants. In other words, they use participants to validate certain methods they have framed before undertaking their studies. You also mentioned that the project empowered the participants. Does this not perpetuate colonial expressions by implying that participants lacked certain knowledge and they were empowered by the researcher or the project?
So in terms of decision, you know, while doing my PhD, I worked with elites of some of the movements in the Niger Delta. And for them, working with them, you know, it was just the normal, you know, interviews, among other things, which they are very familiar with. But when it came to working with the women, and I decided to work, you know, predominantly with local women, I decided to think about a methodology, one that will build trust, and two, that will make them, you know, engage, you know, on an equal platform. So in the process of, I thought about the idea of using participatory videos, did some reading, had discussions with my mentor, Professor Roy McConaughey at the University of Bath. So going to the Delta with the women, I sat with different women groups. Sometimes, you know, I had just one or two, but I sat with different women groups in different communities. And I explained my mission to them. And I said, I asked them, what do you want to do? Do you want us just to talk, you know, me to be asking you and you responding, or are you interested in us working? You know, I introduced the use of, they are familiar, they know what a video is, you know, in Nigeria also. But this time I said to them, I am not going to be the one recording, rather we are going to do this together. So each video clip that you saw in that film was one woman or a group of women, you know, deciding on what they wanted to record. And I gave them, you know, the opportunity to take these videos away. You know, some of them had their children working with them, or their, you know, very close friends. Just an environment where there will be equal participation. And at the end of every day, we would sit together and watch what we recorded. You know, that's the unedited one. We would laugh and so on. But, you know, I came back with the material here to the University of Bath, and it was edited. Then I went back to the Delta. I sat with each group and I showed them, okay, this is what I've done with what we recorded. Some of them, you know, I gave them the power to say, okay, I'm happy with this, or no, I would like you to, you know, maybe change this clip. I want to hear when I said, you know, maybe the issue when I said women are treated as second-class citizens, or when I spoke about, you know, our leader like Ken Saro-Wiwa that championed the cause of nonviolence. So I made sure I went back, you know, got the feedback from them, and I came back. I reworked, and then I went back to them and I showed them, you know, the final material. And when they were happy, that was when I presented it. So in terms of maybe, I don't look at it as a situation where it sort of hinders empowerment. To me, it empowered the few groups that I worked with, because now they know if we want our voices to be heard, we don't have to, you know, continue writing long letters. Rather, I can record, you know, a short, maybe voice clip or a video that would just, you know, say what I want to say. Some of them, you know, would even record maybe some of the issues that are happening, or maybe when they're harassed or during their meetings. So these are things that came up. And I think empowerment is something that came up and played a big role using participatory video. And I'm happy to say now they're aware of, you know, because I worked across different communities and different states, both Bayelsa and River states in the Niger Delta. So some of these local groups are aware of some of their neighbors, as they call them, that they've not been aware of before. And now there's some form of dialogue happening, because some of them don't even know their rights. It is that thing of women being second-class citizens, you know, accepting the role of patriarchy. Thank you.
I want to give the last couple of minutes to Anna, because someone has put in the chat that they would like to hear more about your perspective, Anna. Oppression as an academic coming from the South in the Western context, question mark, question mark. So it's not exactly a question, but I feel like you should be given a chance to say something about that.
Thank you. Okay, well, it's a long story. I will be really brief. Joanna, don't worry. But I never thought about this, but sometimes I go on and on and on about it, but never systematized. So I came very enthusiastic person. I studied, and then I got a job, and I had publications in Spanish. They were taking us, when you are from Latin America and you publish in Spanish, probably these are your friends. Now, if an English scholar publishes in Latin America, this is a success. And so I got lots of publications. Basically, what happened to me is that they put me in my place. It's very simple. As a woman, and as a Latin American, it's very difficult to be an intellectual among men. I am an open Marxist, but even so, also suffer there. It's very difficult. And so I'm extending the notion of coloniality to women as well, because it's very important, to think of the colonial feminism. So everything I was, that's nobody faults, was deculturalized. This is what happens when you move somewhere else. That's not nobody's fault. But then the negotiation of my identity, again, I think I lost a lot. Now we are talking about this 20 years ago to talk about these kind of things, even not so long. For example, in 2012, I submitted a research project to the European Research Council, and they said that I sounded like an activist. That would be not allowed today, and it's only 9 years ago. It's simply because I was talking about decolonizing, participatory action, research methods, etc. Because we are judged with the tools of science. Also, in Latin America, we have much more communication with movements. We have, for example, chairs, cathedrals where they are dedicated to people, famous people or indigenous people. So movements come and go. It's an open place. The university I found here in the UK was very strict, and complete panels talking about climate change. There's no one single activist sitting there. So everything, the dynamics of the university, the knowledge, they knew much less than me because we speak languages, and no offense, but it's very difficult to, or it was very difficult to find someone who knew French literature, for example, bibliography, and I did. So everything was assumed, it was assumed that I knew less. And I have some sentences that some professors, male white professors, have told me, like they're still resonating in my mind. Like I wrote a paper and I gave it to this professor for peer review. He read it, and then when we met, he said, "This is very well written. Have you written this?" For example, so I have many of those. So it was a very interesting experience, but I don't think it's over. So what I'm trying to say, maybe because I'm older, is that I am crisscrossed by the experience of coloniality all the time. It's not that coloniality is there and I am here, and what do I do with this, and what method I apply. When I sit down to talk to someone, whatever, is an indigenous person, a person of color in Latin America, or someone from England, we are all, talk to a Scottish person, an Irish person, we are all, crisscross and yes, inundated, what's the verb, by this coloniality of power. And so, yeah, that's more or less the answer. But of course, if you want more, don't get me started.
Thank you, Anna. That was a really, really moving way, I think, to end this, to pause the discussion. And there's also been lots of interesting comments and points made in the chat. I'm sorry that we don't have time to pick them all up. So we'll take a 10-minute break and we'll come back to the second and final roundtable for today, which is about practices of decolonizing. And I think it's going to be really, really fantastic discussion. And we'll continue, I think, a lot of the themes that have been brought up here. So thanks, everyone.